Well, now that we're all sitting comfortably, good evening, everybody, and welcome. In case you don't know, my name is Michael Toolan. I'm one of the professors of English at the university, and I'm delighted that you've come to this fourth encounter in the School of English's series of readings and talks by distinguished visiting writers and artists under the title Creative Minds at Birmingham. Our visitor today is not a distinguished visitor, but our most distinguished visitor, and it is Michael Longley. On the posters advertising the series, Michael's handsome face is top and center with the other poets around him. That, I think, is a fair representation of the lines of influence and inspiration, putting Michael at the center. It is surely the case that Jamie McKendrick, Alice Oswald, and Kathleen Jamie have found the development of their own voices and themes and forms enriched by their long acquaintance with Michael's work. And what a body of work it is. By my count, more than 20 volumes of poetry. So I will just mention the most recent, The Weather in Japan, from the year 2000, which won the T S Eliot Prize and the Hawthornden Prize. Then Snow Water, 2004. Then This Wonderful Collected Poems, 2006. And most recently, 100 Doors, 2011, which won Ireland's Poetry Now Award. Similarly, he has garnered too many honours for me to state them all. I just have to mention one or two. In 2001, he was the recipient of the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry. And from 2007 to 2010, he was Professor of Poetry for Ireland. And in 2010, in the birthday honours, he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Among the interests that link the very different writers in this Creative Minds series are nature and nationhood. But it was interesting that our most recent previous visitor, Kathleen Jamie, even with the referendum on Scottish independence rapidly approaching, even with that, she was pretty adamant that nature was a lot more important to her than nation and national politics. And I thought it was a telling little moment when I was conducting Kathleen over from Lucas House to the campus for her reading, and I turned to her and said, well, things seem to be hotting up in Scotland now. And she said, no, it's a lot colder than here. And clearly, you know, Alex Salmond and the whole yes versus no campaign was not in the forefront of her thinking, but rather the weather and nature and everything. So for her, nature was a lot more important than nation and national politics, and I suspect that Michael would agree. Not that he is unconcerned with nationhood and the political, but you might say he takes the long view, seeing the conflicts and dilemmas played out in Greek legends or Russian or Japanese stories as real today as our contemporary crises. Accordingly, for example, and drawing on his degree in classics at Trinity College Dublin long ago, and his subsequent immersion in classical literature, Michael has written celebrated poems probing echoes and parallels between the epic slaughter of the Homeric Trojan War and certain phases of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Longley himself is, in a sense, as Irish as you can get. As I mentioned, he was Professor of Poetry for Ireland for 3 years. But his roots are entirely London British. His father was an underage volunteer in the First World War. Yes, his father in the First World War, receiving the Military Cross and lucky to survive where many of his mates did not. But Longley is even more of a poet of nature than of nationhood. Yes, he is rooted in part in that little Irish Eden that is Corrigskeown in County Mayo, which he and Edna and their children and now grandchildren have been returning to for 40 years. But I think it's true to say he's away from there more than he's there, in body at least. And it's the comings and goings in that place and to and from that place that are as much his theme as any fixity of identity that the townland suggests. And those comings and goings are no respecter of borders. So Carrigskeown is a kind of free Irish state. Nobody really owns it, and everyone can use it or their own equivalent place apart differently. as Michael uses it in the poem that closes his collected poems, this volume, the poem called The Wren. There he uses Carrick Sgurwan to urge his sleeping grandsons, 2 of the 7 grandchildren he has, to remember him. And a lot of his poems, I think, are the most beautiful acts of remembrance. In the poem, he describes the wren's song and the undocumented migrations of the hooper swan and the tiny Saharan wheat ear. The wren's song, he says, is a brain-rattling bramble song inside a knothole. Please join me in inviting Michael to take the podium now and to rattle our brains a bit with his bramble songs. Michael Longley.
Well, it's a long time since I read in Birmingham. It's very nice to be back. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me. There's a great Irish poet taught classics here briefly, Louis MacNeice, and his boss was E.R. Dodds, who edited the Bacchae and wrote a wonderful book called The Greeks and the Irrational. And I said to Dodds when I visited him in Oxford that he must have been pleased to move from Birmingham to become Regius Professor of Greek in Oxford. And he said, long live the worst thing I ever did. He said, I hate clever people. I want to read, I'll read for about 40, 50 minutes. I know as somebody that goes to a lot of poetry readings, that's as long as I can concentrate. And I want to go back to early days, to when I was a kid and starting to write. And I'm going to begin with a poem I wrote nearly 50 years ago called Persephone. And I'm reading it because of all the daffodils I've seen around the campus, and the primula and the forsythia. And it's an ancient way of explaining the phenomenon of winter and summer. Persephone ate a seed of the forbidden pomegranate and was condemned to spend 6 months underground and then come back. So it's summer and winter. And I wrote it in spring, 1965. I see, as through a skylight in my brain, the mole strew its buildings in the rain. The swallows turn above their broken home, and all my acres in delirium. Straight-jacketed by cold and numbskulled, now sleep the well-adjusted and the skilled. The bat folds its wing like a winter leaf. The squirrel in its hollow holes aloof. The weasel and ferret, the stoat and fox, move hand in glove across the equinox. I can tell how softly their footsteps go. Their footsteps borrow silence from the snow. I want to proceed with a group of 4 or 5 love poems. I've said in a number of places that I think the core of the poetic enterprise is love poetry, and that if poetry is a wheel, the hub of that wheel is love poetry, and branching out from it like spokes are the other affections and concerns, country, nature, children, and so forth. And the first one I'll introduce, I think I'll introduce them separately. Swan's Mating goes back to being a student at Trinity and walking along the canal in Dublin and sitting down, and much to my amazement and delight, 2 swans came and did this wonderful ballet, which led to copulation. Now, the male swan, who's the cob, he mounts the female, who's the pen, and so that she's submerged. The moment of ignition takes place underwater. A poem from my 30s. Even now, I wish that you had been there, sitting beside me on the riverbank, the cob and his pen sailing in rhythm until their small heads met and the final heraldic moment dissolved in ripples. This was a marriage and a baptism, a holding of breath, nearly a drowning. Wings spread wide for balance where he trod, her feathers full of water, and her neck under the water like a bar of light. These are love poems from different stages of my life. And I'm still writing them. I think if you're still writing love poems in your 70s, you deserve some kind of a medal. Now, this is 6 quatrains, and it's a love poem partly to my native province of Ulster, where the linen industry was very important in the past. But it's mainly about that beautiful fabric, linen. And I think it explains itself, 6 quatrains, but in the middle of the poem there's the image of the bleach grain. And they used to, when they'd made the fabric, lay it out in a bleach green to bleach in the sun, so that at the height of summer it would appear that there'd been a fall of snow. The linen industry. Pulling up flax after the blue flowers have fallen, and laying our handfuls in the peaty water to rot those grasses to the bone, or building stooks that recall the skirts of an invisible dancer, we become a part of the linen industry and follow its processes to the grubby town, where fields are compacted into window boxes and there is little room among the big machines. But even in our attic under the skylight, we make love on a bleach green, the whole meadow draped with material turning white in the sun, as though snow reluctant to melt were our attire. What's passion but a battering of stubborn stalks, then a gentle combing out of fibres like hair, and a weaving of these into christening robes, into garments for a marriage or funeral. Since it's like a bereavement, once the labour's done, to find ourselves last workers in a dying trade. Let flax be our matchmaker, our undertaker, the provider of sheets for whatever the bed. And be shy of your breasts in the presence of death. Say that you look more beautiful in linen, wearing white petticoats, the bow on your bodice, a butterfly attending the embroidered flowers. And one can't go on living and writing at that intensity, really. So the love of poetry is bound to change. And here's one about being married for a long time. The pattern. 36 years to the day after our wedding, when a cold, figure-revealing wind blew against you and lifted your veil, I find in its fat envelope the 6-shilling Vogue pattern for your bride's dress, complicated instructions for stitching bodice and skirt, box pleats and hems, tissue paper outlines, semblances of skin, which I nervously unfold and hold up in snowlight, for snow has been falling on this windless day, and I glimpse your wedding dress and white shoes outside in the transformed garden, where the clothesline and every twig have been covered. A poem called Cloudberries, which come from the tundra, and collecting them is labour intensive, and there are indeed quarrels as to who has harvesting rights, and I refer to those as diplomatic wars in this little poem. Cloudberries. You give me cloudberry jam from Lapland, bog amber, snowline titbits, scrumptious cloudberries, sweetened slowly by the cold, and costly enough for cloudberry wars, diplomatic wars, my dear. Imagine us among the harvesters, keeping our distance in sphagnum fields on the longest day, when dawn and dusk, like frustrated lovers, can kiss, legend has it, once a year. Ah, kisses at our age, cloudberry kisses. I'll take a sup of water. Am I audible at the back? We're living in sorrowful times, and I'm going to read a cluster of war poems. And as Michael said, some of these are derived from the Iliad, which is the greatest thing I've ever read. And the first takes Homer's description of the campfires on the plain of Troy, and he compares them to a starry night, like up above. And in this poem, I bring in cheekily Mayo place names. I hibernicize Homer. campfires. All night, crackling campfires boosted their morale as they dozed in no man's land and the killing fields. There are balmy nights, not a breath, constellations resplendent in the sky around a dazzling moon, when a clearance high in the atmosphere unveils the boundlessness of space. And all the stars are out, lighting up hilltops, glens, headlands, vantage points like Tonic Hera and Alaran, where the tide turns into Killary, where salmon run from the sea, where the shepherd smiles on his luminous townland. That many campfires sparkled in front of Ilium. Between the river and the ships, 1,000 fires. Round each one, 50 men relaxing in the firelight. Shuffling next to the chariots, munching shiny oats and barley, their horses waited for the sunrise. And in August 94, there were rumours that there might be an IRA ceasefire. And I was reading the Iliad in August, and this marvellous passage where the old King Priam visits Achilles to beg Achilles to give up the son, his son Hector, whom Achilles has been, not only has he killed him, but he's mutilating the body. And I thought, wouldn't it be marvellous if I could fit it into if I could compress it into something like a sonnet, and then make my own minuscule contribution to the peace process. Well, I wrote it, compressed it into a sonnet, sent it off to the Irish Times, and the literary editor at that time, John Banville, shouted, "Stop press," and he put it in the following Saturday, which was the week the IRA declared their ceasefire. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, "I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son." And a poem, I have a new book coming out in August called The Stairwell. And this is a poem which links the First World War to the trenches. It's called Boy Soldier. And when I wrote it, I was thinking of my father, who was about 16 when he joined up He joined the London Scottish in Buckingham Palace Road nearly 100 years ago. Boy soldier. The spear point pierces his tender neck. His armour clatters as he hits the ground. Blood soaks his hair, bonny as the graces, braids held in place by gold and silver bands. Think of a smallholder who rears a sapling in a beauty spot a burn burbles through. You can hear its music close to your home. Milky blossoms quivering in the breeze. A spring blizzard blows in from nowhere and uproots it, laying its branches out. Thus, Euphorbus, the son of Pantheus, a boy soldier, the London Scottish say, the Inniskillings, the Duke of Wellington, was killed and despoiled by Menelaus. And two short poems, 6 lines and 5 lines, the first of which ends with the last 2 lines of Book 4 of the Iliad. My father was wounded at the notorious Battle of at High Wood. I picture my gentle dad at High Wood, lying wounded among the splintered trees and unburied dead, some of them his mates, some his victims, shot and bayoneted. Many Trojans and Achaeans fell that day and lay side by side, faces in the mud. The horses of Rhesus. Odysseus yanked corpses by the ankle and cleared a path for the horses of Rhesus. They were whiter than snow and wind-speedy and wavy-maned and very beautiful and unused to treading on dead soldiers. Now, the whole pain and agony of what happens in the Iliad and the battles is often heightened by glimpses you get of normality and home and domesticity. And this poem's called Lunch, which must be one of the most boring words in the world. Which is why a friend of mine, a High Court judge, always refers to it as luncheon. Anyway, lunch. And the first part of this is about the woodcutter image that Homer uses to remind us of normality. And then the second part, the poem's two 10-line sections. The second part imagines the field kitchens and my father among the soldiers queuing up. Lunch. Missiles find their mark. On both sides, soldiers fall. Mutual wounds. But the Greeks break through at that time of day when the woodcutter, his arms exhausted from chopping trees, his stomach rumbling, prepares his lunch. Field kitchen smells, memories of home between explosions. Dad, Can that be you rattling your mess tin and belly aching about the bully beef as the Germans advance? Here is an apple wrapped in tranquility. And about 14 months ago, I lost my twin brother. He died, and I was blessed really to be with him when he died. And his wife, my sister-in-law Catherine, took the sheets aside and showed me his beautiful feet. Peter was a marine engineer. And this poem is dedicated to Catherine. And Whitburn's a little village north of Newcastle upon Tyne where they lived. The feet for Catherine. You showed me my twin's feet when he was dead, your sailor husband's feet, your engineers. How cold they felt, how handsome ankle and toe, bone shapes out of our gloomy womb tangle. A god's immortal feet, I'll dare to think, when we scatter his ashes in the North Sea, off the windy pier at Whitburn village. Poseidon, say, who drives his chariot's bronze-hoofed horses so headlong over the waves, all the sea creatures know who it must be, and the sea parts with a kind of happiness, and the axle doesn't even get wet. One of the things I regret never having done is horse riding. I've got a thing about horses. And here's another Homeric moment which I've pinched and done something with. And it's called The Foals. Wherever you are, you can find the space for thousands of mares and their glossy foals, grazing the water meadow in family groups. The north wind falls in love with 2 or 3, and disguised as a black-maned stallion, blows in off the North Sea and impregnates, how many mares would you say? The result, in any case, my dear twin, is 12 foals. And it's these I want to tell you about. Isn't there a cornfield close to your house on the by road into Whitburn village? 12 racehorses in the making, so fast they will zoom over the top of the harvest without breaking a single ear of corn. And the whole of the second section of this book is it says, for Peter, my twin. And in this poem, I remember and celebrate him in terms of Corrigsky-One, this remote townland where we have been going for more than 40 years. And the 27th of July last year was the first birthday I spent without my twin. So I remember him in terms of that wonderful elemental landscape, with some of the place names in it: Alaran, Duoctree, Corrigsky-One itself, and the plain, the sandy plain beyond the dunes is called the Dúch. In Scotland, Kathleen Jamie would have used the word, it's the Macher. And here it is. Chuffs, by the way, go pshaw, pshaw, pshaw. Lovely noise. The birthday. This is our first birthday without you, my twin, July the 27th. Where are you now? I'm looking out for you. Have you been skinny dipping at a larren where the jellies won't sting? Or in the lake among the reeds and damselflies, sandwort stars at your feet, grass of Parnassus in bud. This year, the residential swans have cygnets, 4 of them. They won't mind you splashing, nor will the sandpipers eyeing Duoctree for a nesting place among the pebbles at the samphire line. Now you know the spot. Chuffs flock high above their acrobatic cliff face and call to you antiquated expletives, pshaw, pshaw, pshaw. Again and again I mention the erratic boulder because so much happens there. 5 hares in the morning, then a squiggle of stoats. I've boiled organic beetroots for supper. Will your pea be pink in heaven? Oh, the infinite gradations of sunset here. Thank you for visiting Corrigskeewone. Don't twist your ankle in a rabbit hole. I'll carry the torch across the Dúch. And I'll draw to a close with 2 grandparent poems, or 2 grandchildren poems. My wife, who's astringent, said as I got into the taxi this morning, she said, don't be all fluffy and grandparental. But anyway, our 7th, I wrote, the last poem I'm going to read is a poem I wrote for my grandson, the first one to come along, and then a second one and a third one and a fourth one came along. And I realized I was supposed to write, I expected to write poems for each one of them, and I did. And then I said, after the 4th boy, I said, well, I'm going on strike unless the next one's a girl. And the next 3 have been girls. And so there's been no escape from the... But I mean, it's a huge gift. I have no idea where the tenderness I feel comes from. I mean, having children doesn't quite prepare one for the depth of tenderness one feels for these little lives. And I don't think there are many grandchild poems. I think it's because most poets don't live long enough. Anyway, here's one for little Amelia, and they now live in the Highlands of Scotland, close to Kyle of Lochout. And in the poem is built around a gynecological technical term, meconium, which is the first bowel movement of a newborn baby. And it's black and sticky, and it's very like an otter's sprint. Now, I mention the sprint because at least 3 of my literary friends didn't know what a sprint was, an otter's dropping. But anyway, I also refer to 2 ponies called Whisper and Silver. And this is called, I just call this simply Amelia's poem. Amelia, your newborn name combines with the midwife's word, and like smoke from driftwood fires, wafts over the lochside road past the wattle bar. hay bales for ponies, silver and whisper. Between dry stone walls, river, rounded, moss-clad, ferny stones. Through the fenceless gate and gorse, to the flat, heraldic boulder, to the flat, erratic boulder, where otters and your mother rest. Sprints black as your meconium, fish bones, fish scales, shitty sequins reflecting what light remains. I think a heraldic boulder is better than erratic, perhaps. I hate it when I make a mistake. And if you could see the gaze of this child, I don't think she would forgive me if she was here. And I'll end with the first of the sequence of poems. And thank you for listening and for turning out on this rather gloomy afternoon. The weather in Belfast is even worse. I don't need to explain this at all, except to say that the little river is called the Owen Aosdána, beautiful, the Owen Aosdána, the leveret, for my grandson Ben. This is your first night in Corrigsgee. The Owen Aosdána is so full of rain. You arrived in Paddy Morrison's tractor, a bumpy approach in your father's arms, to the cottage where, all of 1 year ago, you were conceived, a fireseed in the hearth. Did you hear the wind in the fluffy chimney? Do you hear the wind tonight, and the rain, and a shorebird calling from the mussel reefs? Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the sea, little hoplite. Have you been missing it? I'll park your chariot by the Otter's Rock and carry you over seaweed to the sea. There's a tufted duck on David's Lake with her suit full of hatchlings, pom-poms a day old and already learning to dive. We may meet the stoat near the erratic boulder, a shrew in his mouth, or the merlin meadow pipit hunting. But don't be afraid. The leveret breakfasts under the fuchsia every morning, and we shall be watching. I have picked wildflowers for you, scabious and century, in a jam jar of water that will bend and magnify the daylight. This is your first night in Corrigsgee. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much, Michael, for those wonderfully evocative, scene-projecting poems. We have a few minutes for discussion. If people would like to ask questions of Michael, he's kindly said he would be happy to. Yes, sir.
No. Unfortunately, when he died, I was only about 19, and I thought I knew everything, and that he knew nothing. So that's one of my chief regrets, was that I didn't ask him. He did tell my twin and me one or two anecdotes, but I think practically all the survivors of that nightmare chose not to speak about it. I've written a lot of poems about him now, you know, and I think that's partly to make up for not having talked to him. You know. He was a very beautiful man, I realise that now. And he was wise, despite the fact he read the Daily Mail and the News of the World. Oh, yeah.
You published a beautiful poem about him in the London Review of Books, I think, just fairly recently, called Marigolds.
Oh, that's I couldn't read that poem,
No,
you know.
No.
It's an unendurable poem.
It's very poignant.
For me, yeah, when he died in summer 1960, and I was home from Trinity College for Easter, just a few months before he died. And my very first poem had appeared in Icarus, the college magazine, and it was called Marigolds. And she gave him marigolds the colour of autumn to keep in his cold room, and the late light of autumn gilded all their moments in rather a limp-wristed piece. And the last person I wanted to find it was my father. Well, he did discover it, and he said, "Michael, it's not worth the paper it's printed on." Which might have been true, but he shouldn't have said that, but he was in pain. And then I was telling a group of school kids this story. In 2001, I was in Buckingham Palace receiving the Queen's Gold Medal from the Queen, and I showed her a photograph of my father receiving the Military Cross from George V, and I said, "May I show you this photograph of my father receiving a medal from your grandfather?" And she was very taken with it. And I said, "May I ask where that spot is?" And she said, she said, "That's out the back." You know, it made you think of a patio with a barbecue in it, you know, out the back. And I said, "May I go there?" And she said, "After the audience, I will arrange for my equerry to take you there." And she did. And I was able to work out from the balustrades the exact spot where my father had stood, getting his medal for gallantry, and where I was getting my medal for poetry. And I thought inwardly to myself that marigolds wasn't such an awful thing after all. Yeah.
There's a question at the back.
I didn't quite catch that.
What is it about the Iliad you like so much?
You haven't read it? Oh, I envy you. I envy you the first time. It's the greatest poem that I know, the greatest about war and death, but especially death, you know. It's endless and bottomless, and I feel that poetry changed. It can't go on. Poetry always has to change, but it didn't get any better after the Iliad. Nothing was better than the Iliad. The same way that music had to change after Bach, which it did, but it didn't get any better. You know? Anyway, may I recommend it?
More questions, please. Yes, also at the back.
No, as Michael said, although I'm Irish, I can feel Irish, and I was inconsolable a few weeks ago when England beat Ireland at rugby. So I'm Irish, but I'm true to the Britannic side, to the British side. And my grandparents were Londoners, and I never met my father's father. He was a journeyman carpenter. And I only met my Grandpa George, my mother's father, 2 or 3 times. And although he left a vivid impression, he was very cockney and a bit of a show-off, Grandpa George. Not the subtlest human being I've ever known. So that's a gap, you know. The marvelous thing about grandparenthood is you acquire a new title. You acquire new titles, you know. Papa and Grandad. It's like being promoted for doing nothing.
I think someone had a hand up there.
Well, it was around about 16. I was about 16. That huge explosion, you know, of gonads and an aesthetic awakening. It was those two things, sexual and aesthetic awakening, and discovering big, heavy Thames and Hudson books in the school library, and looking at Van Gogh and Monet and Toulouse-Lautrec and all the great French painters. Discovering that, going to the Ulster Hall to hear the city, it was called the City of Belfast Orchestra, and discovering Sibelius, and LP Records had just, we'd moved from 78 to LP Records, and I spent all my pocket money on classical music records, some jazz. And I discovered Keats and girls. And in order to impress the girls, I wrote poems. It was not a successful exercise. And then, once you've done it, it's the, who is it talks about the fascination of what's, Yeats, the fascination of what's difficult. And the struggle, the exploration through words of a vaguely apprehended notion. That seems to me what it's about. And the first time you do that, you're hooked. I mean, the great Irish poet, Patrick Kavanagh, said somewhere, you know, a young man dabbles in verses to discover that they have become his life. Couldn't put it any better than that.
Yes.
You were part of a constellation of great Northern Irish poets, and you read us some wonderful elegiac poems tonight to your twin and to your father. I wondered if we might expect some kind of elegy to Seamus Heaney on the horizon.
Well, when Seamus died, I was wakened up in the morning by a local radio station and said, "Have you heard that Seamus Heaney has died?" I said, "No." And she said, "Would you care to say a few words?" I said, "No." But I had written a poem. I can read you a little cluster of poems. I know, perhaps I can't really, you know. But I wrote a poem Seamus and I were getting degrees in UCD in Dublin, and there was a big dinner afterwards, luncheon, at luncheon. It's such a marvellously pretentious word, isn't it? Luncheon. Michael and I had luncheon today. And Seamus leaned down the table and he said, what's the Greek for boat? And you know you have these blackouts. Well, there was I in this learned company who would pretend to be a translator of Homer. I couldn't remember. Scathos, of course. I couldn't remember. So I was so embarrassed that I wrote a poem called Boat for Seamus. And then I went to visit his grave. I'd gone to his funeral, but not to the graveyard in Bellaghy. So I went some months later, and I wrote a little 6-line poem to go with Boat. I shall read them, shall I? Because I really loved Seamus, you know, and I miss him. And I put these in the Irish Times as a kind of part way to an elegy. But I don't know. Everyone's writing elegies, and I never like doing what everybody, for Seamus, I never like doing what everyone else is doing. Never have. So the first is about 8 lines long. It's called Boat. You know, it's a little squib. Although Mary Heaney said it moved her to tears. And then just a few weeks ago, I wrote this little 6-liner, and it quotes at the end Psalm 91. So this is for Seamus. Boat, what for Seamus? What's the Greek for boat, you ask, old friend, fellow voyager approaching Ithaca? Oh, flatulent sails, wave winnowing oars, shingle scrunching keel. But so close to home, there's a danger always of amnesiac storms, waterlogged words. Sam. One wreath had blackberry clusters intertwined. Was it a blackbird or wren that briefly sang a graveside aria, godlike in its way, a psalm? He will defend you under his wing. You will be safe under his feathers.
Perhaps that would be a good place to close. Let me thank Michael once again for a wonderful reading and some very thought-provoking answers as well. Michael Longley.